On the morning of October 14th, 2011, Elara Vance failed to arrive for her 9 o'clock shift at the downtown architecture firm, where she worked as a junior project manager. This was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Elara was known for her punctuality and unwavering professionalism, a woman who treated her responsibilities with a seriousness that bordered on religious devotion. Her direct supervisor, a man named Robert Davies, was the first to notice her absence. He had initially assumed she was merely running late, perhaps caught in the unexpected snarl of city traffic. But as the clock ticked past 10 and then 11, his mild annoyance curdled into genuine concern. Robert had tried calling Elara's cell phone multiple times. Each call went directly to voicemail, her cheerful, recorded greeting, a stark contrast to the growing unease in his office. He had also sent a brief, professional email, which remained unanswered. By lunchtime, Robert Davies decided to contact Elara's emergency contact, her older sister, Chloe. He explained the situation calmly, trying not to alarm her, but the subtext of his call was unmistakable. For a person as reliable as Elara Vance, an unannounced absence was not just unusual, it was unthinkable. Chloe had felt an immediate, cold spike of fear. She assured Robert that she would try to reach Elara and would go to her apartment if necessary. Chloe knew her sister's routines intimately, and this deviation was a blaring siren in the quiet landscape of their lives. Chloe's own calls to her sister's phone had yielded the same result, straight to voicemail. She then called Elara's closest friend, a woman named Jenna, who confirmed she had not heard from Elara since the previous evening. A knot of dread tightened in Chloe's stomach as she left her own office and began the drive to her sister's apartment building. Elara lived in a modest but well-kept apartment complex on the edge of the city's historic district. It was a place she had chosen for its quiet streets and proximity to a park where she often went for long runs. When Chloe arrived, she found Elara's car, a sensible blue sedan, parked in its designated spot. Standing outside her sister's front door, Chloe had called out Elara's name, her voice echoing in the silent hallway. There was no response. After knocking several times with no answer, she used the spare key Elara had given her for emergencies. The apartment was quiet and still. Everything appeared to be in its proper place, a testament to Elara's meticulous nature. A half-finished mug of tea sat on the coffee table, a book lying open beside it. In the kitchen, a grocery list was stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet. On the counter, her purse sat next to her keys, a detail that immediately struck Chloe as wrong. Elara never went anywhere without her purse and keys. A quick search of the small apartment confirmed that Elara was not there. Her bed was neatly made, and her work clothes for the day were not laid out as they usually would have been. It was as if she had simply vanished from the middle of her evening routine. With a growing sense of panic, Chloe dialed 911. She explained the situation to the dispatcher, her voice trembling as she recounted the uncharacteristic absence, the unanswered calls, and the strange state of the apartment. A missing person report was officially filed for 28-year-old Elara Vance. The initial responding officers conducted a preliminary sweep of the apartment. They noted the lack of any obvious signs of forced entry or a struggle. The scene was disturbingly serene, offering no immediate clues as to what might have happened. Detectives were assigned to the case that same afternoon. They began by establishing a timeline of Elara's last known movements. Her sister Chloe and friend Jenna were the first to be formally interviewed. Jenna had last spoken to Elara around 8 o'clock the previous evening. She said their conversation was normal, discussing work and making tentative plans for the upcoming weekend. According to Jenna, Elara had sounded perfectly fine, perhaps a little tired from a long week, but otherwise her usual self. Chloe had last seen her sister 2 days prior on Sunday for their weekly family dinner. She described Elara as being in good spirits, excited about a new project at work, and talking about her plans to start training for a half marathon. Nothing in her demeanor suggested she was in any kind of trouble or distress. The investigators began building a profile of the missing woman. Elara Vance was, by all accounts, a model citizen. She was a rising star at her firm, a loving daughter and sister, and a loyal friend. She had no known enemies, no history of drug or alcohol abuse, and no significant financial problems. Her life was one of structure and ambition. Friends and family described her as cautious and risk-averse, not the type of person to make a spontaneous trip or disappear without telling anyone. The mystery of her vanishing deepened with every testament to her reliability. Detectives next turned their attention to Elara's digital footprint. They obtained warrants for her phone records and online activity. The phone records confirmed that the last outgoing call was to her friend Jenna the previous night. After that, her phone had seemingly been turned off. Her financial records showed no activity in the past 24 hours. Her last transaction was at a grocery store near her apartment, on her way home from work the day she disappeared. Security footage from the store showed her shopping alone, looking calm and unremarkable. The investigation into her personal life included a look at her romantic history. Elara had ended a 2-year relationship with a man named Leo Sterling about 6 months prior. Friends described the breakup as difficult but amicable. When detectives interviewed Leo Sterling, he appeared cooperative and visibly upset by the news of Elara's disappearance. He stated that he had not seen or spoken to her in several weeks, though they had exchanged a few cordial text messages. He had a solid alibi for the night in question, which was quickly verified by his roommate. Days turned into a week, and there was still no sign of Elara. The police conducted thorough searches of the area around her apartment, including the park where she frequently ran. They used search dogs and teams of volunteers, but the search yielded nothing. Her case was featured on the local news. Her smiling photograph displayed alongside pleas from her family for any information. The public response was significant, with dozens of tips pouring in, but each one led to a dead end. The investigators were left with a frustrating puzzle. They had a missing person who was the very definition of responsible, an apartment that looked untouched, and a complete lack of any forensic evidence to suggest foul play. It was a case without a crime scene. Frustrated by the lack of progress, the lead detective ordered another, more meticulous search of Elara's apartment. He believed they must have missed something, some small detail that could unlock the case. He instructed the team to look for anything out of place, no matter how insignificant it seemed. It was during this second search, nearly 10 days after Elara had vanished, that a junior officer found something. Tucked away at the back of a closet, beneath a stack of old blankets, was a small, leather-bound journal. It was the kind of discovery that could change the entire direction of an investigation. The journal was Elara's. Her name was embossed in small gold letters on the cover. Inside, the pages were filled with her neat, precise handwriting. The first entry was dated almost a year ago. As the detectives began to read, a new and disturbing picture of Elara Vance began to emerge. The woman who wrote in this journal was not the confident, happy person her friends and family had described. This woman was anxious, fearful, and consumed by a growing sense of paranoia. The early entries were mundane, detailing her work projects, her training for a 10,000 race, and her relationship with her then-boyfriend, Leo. But gradually, the tone began to shift. She wrote about feeling a persistent sense of being watched. An entry from 8 months prior read, "I feel like there are eyes on me when I walk home. I keep looking over my shoulder, but there's never anyone there. It's probably just the stress from work getting to me." This was the first mention of a feeling that would soon dominate her writing. As the entries continued, Her anxiety became more pronounced. She described seeing the same dark-colored car parked on her street on different days. She wrote about hearing strange noises outside her apartment at night, like footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. A particularly chilling entry from 5 months before her disappearance detailed an incident in the park. She had been on her usual running path when she felt certain someone was following her, staying just out of sight behind the trees. She had cut her run short and hurried home, her heart pounding with a fear she could not explain. The detectives were stunned. This secret world of fear was completely unknown to her family and friends. When questioned again, both Chloe and Jenna attested that Elara had never mentioned feeling unsafe or being followed. This revelation forced investigators to consider two possibilities. Either Elara was suffering from a serious, undiagnosed mental health issue that caused these paranoid delusions, or she was being stalked by someone, and her fears were very real. The journal also shed a new, more troubling light on her breakup with Leo Sterling. While friends had called it amicable, Elara's writing painted a different picture. She described him as becoming increasingly possessive and controlling in the final months of their relationship. One entry read, "Leo gets so angry when I want to spend time with my friends. He says I don't need anyone but him. It's suffocating." Another entry, written shortly before the breakup, said, "I have to get out. I feel like I'm disappearing." Armed with this new information, detectives brought Leo Sterling in for a second interview. This time, the tone was less conversational and more accusatory. They confronted him with the excerpts from Elara's journal. Leo vehemently denied the allegations. He admitted that their breakup had been more contentious than he had initially let on, but he insisted he had never been controlling or possessive. He claimed Elara had become distant and secretive in the last few months of their relationship, and he had simply been trying to understand why. He suggested that the journal entries were a reflection of her own internal struggles, not his behavior. He maintained his alibi for the night of her disappearance and willingly provided access to his phone and computer for forensic analysis. The search of his devices turned up nothing incriminating. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, Leo Sterling became the primary person of interest in the case. The journal provided a potential motive. Investigators theorized that he had been unable to accept the breakup and had begun stalking Elara, his obsession culminating in her abduction. As detectives delved deeper into the journal, they found a recurring and deeply unsettling element. Elara had started to write about a figure she called the Shadow Man. This was not a name for Leo, but something else entirely. The first mention appeared about 3 months before she went missing. She wrote, "I saw him again tonight, the Shadow Man. He just stands across the street near the old oak tree. I can't see his face, just his outline in the dark." Her descriptions of this figure were vague and filled with terror. He was tall, always wore dark clothing, and never approached her directly. He was simply there, a silent, menacing presence at the edge of her life. The entries about the Shadow Man became more frequent and more frantic. "He was outside my building tonight," she wrote. "I saw him from my window. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They think I'm crazy." Investigators checked police records and found a record of Elara's call. A patrol car had been dispatched to her address for a report of a suspicious person. The responding officers had canvassed the area, but found no one. The report noted that the caller seemed highly anxious. This discovery was a critical turning point. It provided external corroboration for at least one of the frightening events described in her journal. Her fear was not entirely in her head. Someone or something had been tormenting her. The question for investigators was whether the Shadow Man was a real person. Was it Leo Sterling disguising himself to intimidate her? Or was it someone else entirely? A stranger who had developed a dangerous fixation on her? Detectives canvassed Elara's neighborhood again, this time showing her photo and asking if anyone had seen her with someone or noticed anyone suspicious lurking around. Most residents had seen nothing unusual. However, one elderly woman who lived in the building across the street recalled seeing a man standing near the oak tree on several occasions late at night. Her description was hazy. She could only say that he was tall and wore a dark coat. She had assumed he was just waiting for someone. This small piece of information gave more weight to the theory that Elara was being stalked. The focus of the investigation intensified. Detectives re-examined every detail of her life, searching for anyone who might fit the description of this mysterious figure. They looked into her colleagues at the architecture firm. They were all interviewed again, and their backgrounds were scrutinized. One co-worker, a quiet draftsman named Marcus, had reportedly shown some romantic interest in Elara, which she had politely rebuffed. Marcus was brought in for questioning. He was a tall man who often wore dark clothing. He admitted to having a crush on Elara, but was adamant that he had never followed her or tried to intimidate her. His alibi for the night she disappeared was weak. He claimed he was home alone watching television. For a time, Marcus became a secondary person of interest. Investigators dug into his past, looking for any history of similar behavior. They found nothing. He had no criminal record and was described by others as shy and harmless. Without more evidence, they could not hold him. Section. The journal remained the centerpiece of the investigation. Forensic linguists were brought in to analyze the writing. They noted the escalating tone of fear and the consistency in the descriptions of the shadow man, suggesting it was not a fabrication, but a genuine perception of a threat. The final entry in the journal was made on the night she disappeared. It was short, and the handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. It read, "He knows my name. He spoke to me. He's not a shadow anymore." This last entry was terrifying. It suggested a direct confrontation. The stalker, this figure who had tormented her from a distance, had finally crossed a line and made direct contact. The investigators believed that whatever had happened to Elara had happened shortly after she wrote those words. Despite this chilling clue, the trail was growing cold. Leo Sterling's alibi remained solid, and the forensic analysis of his belongings had cleared him. The investigation into Marcus, the coworker, had produced no evidence to link him to the disappearance. The shadow man remained a ghost. Months passed, turning into a year. Elara's case remained open but was no longer front-page news. Her family and friends struggled to navigate a world without answers, caught in the agonizing limbo of not knowing whether she was alive or dead. Chloe became a tireless advocate for her sister. She organized vigils, maintained a social media page dedicated to the search, and periodically met with detectives to ask about any new developments. Each time, the answer was the same. There were no new leads. The police department had exhausted all available avenues. They had interviewed over 100 people, followed up on countless tips, and spent thousands of hours analyzing the scant evidence they had. Elara Vance had vanished, and her journal was the only testament to the terror she had experienced in her final months. The case was eventually moved to the cold case unit. It was a file filled with frustrating questions and very few answers. Who was the shadow man? Was he a real person or a manifestation of a psychological crisis? And what had happened after Elara wrote that final, horrifying entry in her journal? For the detectives who had worked the case from the beginning, it was a source of profound professional and personal frustration. They felt they had failed Elara. Her journal was a cry for help that they had only heard after it was too late. 2 years after Elara's disappearance, a new detective was assigned to the cold case unit. His name was David Chen, a veteran investigator known for his methodical approach and his refusal to let old files gather dust. He decided to start a full review of the Elara Vance case from scratch. Detective Chen spent weeks reading every report, every transcript and every lab result. He paid special attention to the journal, reading it multiple times, trying to see it not just as evidence, but as the story of a woman in crisis. He was struck by the specificity of some of Elara's entries. She had not just written about general feelings of being watched. She had documented specific times and places. She had mentioned the dark-colored car, the footsteps in the hall, and the figure by the oak tree. Chen believed that the original investigators had become too focused on the two most obvious suspects, Leo and Marcus. He wanted to broaden the scope and look for someone who might have been hiding in plain sight, someone who had not been on their radar at all. He started by re-examining Elara's financial records, but this time he went back further, looking at the 2 years leading up to her disappearance. He was searching for any anomaly, any transaction that seemed out of place for a person as meticulous and careful as Elara. It was a tedious process, combing through thousands of lines of data. But then he found something. It was a series of regular monthly payments, listed as investment consulting, made to an individual, not a company. The name on the payments was Arthur Finch. Arthur Finch was not a name that had appeared anywhere in the original case file. He was not a family member, a co-worker, or a known friend. The payments had started about 18 months before Elara disappeared and had stopped abruptly the month she went missing. Detective Chen began to dig into Arthur Finch's background. He was a man in his late 40s who presented himself as a freelance financial advisor. He had a small, unimpressive online presence and no formal certifications. He seemed to operate on the fringes of the financial world. Chen discovered that Elara had been introduced to Arthur Finch through a distant acquaintance at a community event. Finch had apparently convinced her that he could help her grow her savings more aggressively than a traditional bank could. Elara, ever ambitious and focused on her future, had decided to hire him. The detective arranged to speak with the acquaintance who had made the introduction. The person remembered Finch as being charismatic and persuasive, but also a bit intense. They had lost touch with him years ago and were surprised to hear his name come up in connection with Elara. Now, Detective Chen had a new person of interest, one who had a direct financial link to Elara, and who had been completely overlooked. He began to investigate Arthur Finch with a quiet intensity. He pulled Finch's own financial records and discovered a man who was deeply in debt. It appeared that Finch was not investing his clients' money at all. He was using it to pay off his own creditors and fund a lifestyle he could not afford. He was running a small-scale Ponzi scheme, and Elara Vance had been one of his victims. Chen hypothesized a motive. Elara was smart and detail-oriented. It was only a matter of time before she would have discovered the fraud. Perhaps she had already started to suspect something was wrong, and Finch had decided to silence her before she could expose him. This theory provided a new lens through which to view the journal. What if the paranoia Elara had been feeling was not related to a romantic obsession, but a financial one? What if the shadow man was not a stalker in the traditional sense, but a predator of a different kind? Detective Chen looked for a photograph of Arthur Finch. When he found one, a chill ran down his spine. Finch was tall and had a preference for dark, conservative suits. He fit the vague physical description of the man the elderly neighbor had seen standing by the oak tree. The next step was to locate Arthur Finch. It turned out he had moved out of state about a year after Elara's disappearance. Chen coordinated with the local police in the new state and discovered that Finch was living a quiet life in a suburban community, still operating as a freelance financial consultant. Detective Chen and his partner flew out to interview him. They approached him at his home under the pretense of discussing a financial matter. Finch was initially calm and composed, the picture of a respectable professional. Chen began by asking general questions about his former clients. Then he mentioned the name Elara Vance. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Arthur Finch's face. He claimed to have a vague recollection of her, but said he had not spoken to her in years. Chen then produced a copy of one of Elara's bank statements, showing a payment to Finch. He asked Finch to explain the nature of their business relationship. Finch's composure began to crack. He became defensive, his answers evasive. The detective then steered the conversation to the night of Elara's disappearance. He asked Finch where he was on the evening of October 13th, 2011. Finch claimed he could not remember, that it was too long ago. It was at this moment that Chen decided to present his theory. He described the journal, the entries about being watched, and the figure of the shadow man. He looked directly at Arthur Finch and said, "She was getting close to figuring you out, wasn't she, Arthur? She was starting to ask too many questions." Finch's face paled. He denied everything, but his denial was weak, his voice strained. The detectives knew they were on the right track. While they did not have enough to arrest him for murder, they had more than enough evidence to arrest him for fraud. Arthur Finch was taken into custody on charges related to his financial scheme. The arrest allowed investigators to obtain a warrant to search his property. They were hoping to find something, anything, that could connect him directly to Elara's disappearance. The search of his home and computer revealed the full extent of his crimes. He had defrauded over a dozen clients, with Elara being one of the most significant. They found emails in his deleted folder that showed Elara had begun to question him about the lack of returns on her investment in the weeks before she vanished. The key breakthrough, however, came from an unexpected source. During the search of his garage, investigators found a set of old gardening tools. On one of the shovels, buried deep within the soil residue, forensic analysts found a microscopic trace of DNA. The sample was degraded after so many years, but the lab was able to generate a partial profile. It was not enough for a conclusive match, but it was consistent with Elara Vance's DNA profile, which was on file from the initial investigation. It was the first piece of physical evidence ever found that linked a suspect to the victim. Faced with the fraud charges and the new forensic evidence, the detectives decided to re-interview Finch. They laid out the case against him, the financial motive, the emails, his physical resemblance to the shadow man, and now the DNA on the shovel. For hours, Arthur Finch remained silent, his face a mask of cold indifference. But as the weight of the evidence pressed down on him, he finally broke. He agreed to tell them what had happened in exchange for a plea deal that would take the death penalty off the table. His confession was chilling in its detached, self-serving narrative. He admitted that Elara had become suspicious of his handling of her money. She was smart, and he knew she would soon uncover his entire scheme, which would have sent him to prison. He had decided he had to intimidate her into silence. He began a subtle campaign of psychological terror, hoping to make her feel unstable and discredit her if she ever went to the authorities. He was the one who parked the car on her street, who walked through her apartment hallway late at night, and who stood across the street, becoming the figure she called the Shadow Man. His goal was to frighten her, but it had the opposite effect. Her questions became more direct, more insistent. On the night she disappeared, he had gone to her apartment to confront her, intending to scare her one last time. He had waited for her in the shadows of her parking lot. When she got out of her car, he had spoken her name. This was the moment she described in her journal. "He knows my name. He's not a shadow anymore." According to Finch, Elara had not been scared. She had been angry. She had recognized him and immediately threatened to call the police and expose him. In that moment, Finch said he had panicked. He had grabbed her and forced her into his car. He had driven her to a remote, wooded area miles outside the city. He claimed he had only intended to leave her there, to give him time to escape. But their argument had escalated, and in a fit of rage, he had killed her. He then buried her body in a shallow grave. As part of his plea agreement, Arthur Finch led the detectives to the location. After nearly 5 years, the remains of Elara Vance were finally recovered. The long, agonizing wait for her family was over, though it ended in the heartbreak they had always feared. Arthur Finch pleaded guilty to charges of murder and fraud. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who had haunted Elara's final months, the real-life monster behind the spectral name of the Shadow Man, was finally held accountable. The resolution of the case brought a somber sense of closure to all who had been involved. The journal, once a collection of mysterious and terrifying entries, could now be understood for what it truly was: a meticulous record of a victim's dawning awareness of the evil that had entered her life. Elara Vance had not been suffering from delusions. Her fear was real, her instincts correct. She had been a victim of a cold and calculating predator who had targeted her for her trusting nature and her ambition. In the end, her own careful documentation of the terror she was experiencing became the key to solving her own murder. Her words, written in secret and in fear, reached out from the past to ensure that her killer would not escape justice. The case of Elara Vance serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who wear the most convincing masks. They are not shadows lurking in the dark, but the people who smile, who offer a helping hand, and who gain our trust before they destroy it. Her family, while devastated by their loss, took some comfort in knowing the truth. They remembered Elara not as a victim defined by her final days, but as the vibrant, intelligent, and kind woman she had been throughout her life. Her story, though tragic, became a testament to her strength, a voice that refused to be silenced, even in death. The discovery of Arthur Finch also had a ripple effect, leading investigators to his other victims of fraud. While Elara was the only one he had physically harmed, he had financially ruined several other families. The full scope of his predatory nature was laid bare for the world to see. The lead detective on the original case, long since retired, was informed of the resolution. He expressed a profound sense of relief, mixed with regret that they had not identified Finch sooner. The focus on the ex-boyfriend, fueled by the journal's descriptions of a controlling relationship, had been a critical misdirection. It was a humbling lesson in the complexities of an investigation. Evidence can often point in multiple directions, and the most obvious interpretation is not always the correct one. Elara's journal was the perfect example. It told the truth, but in a language that the investigators had initially misunderstood. They had seen the words controlling and suffocating and immediately thought of a romantic partner. They had failed to consider that a financial advisor could exert a different, but equally insidious, form of control over a person's life. Arthur Finch had not only stolen Elara's money, he had stolen her sense of security. He had methodically dismantled her peace of mind, turning her own home and her neighborhood into places of fear. This psychological torture was a crime in itself, a prelude to the final act of violence. In the years following the trial, Chloe Vance became an advocate for victims' rights and financial literacy. She shared her sister's story to warn others about the dangers of unregulated financial advisors and the importance of trusting one's instincts. She ensured that Elara's legacy would be one of helping others. The park where Elara used to run, the place where she first felt the chilling presence of her stalker, eventually had a memorial bench installed in her honor. It was a small, quiet tribute to a life cut short, a place for reflection and remembrance. The leather-bound journal was returned to her family. It was no longer just a piece of evidence in a murder case, but a sacred text of their daughter and sister's final days. It was a painful but necessary reminder of her courage in the face of a hidden and terrifying threat. The case files on Elara Vance are now closed. The questions that had haunted detectives for years have been answered. But the sense of tragedy remains, a permanent scar on the community and on the hearts of those who loved her. The story of the Shadow Man had come to an end, but the memory of Elara Vance, a bright and promising young woman who deserved so much more from life, would endure forever. Her voice, captured in ink on paper, had ultimately been her most powerful weapon. The initial response to Elara's disappearance had been textbook. Patrol officers secured the scene, detectives were called in, and the process of interviewing witnesses and collecting information began immediately. The efficiency of the police response was never in question. What had stymied the investigation was the nature of the perpetrator himself. Arthur Finch was a ghost in Elara's personal life. He did not exist in her circle of friends, her family, or her workplace. He was a professional acquaintance, a name on a bank statement, and therefore invisible to an investigation focused on personal relationships. This oversight highlighted a common vulnerability in modern life. People often compartmentalize their lives, with professional and financial dealings kept separate from their personal and social spheres. Finch had exploited this separation to the fullest. He knew that Elara's friends and family would likely have no idea who he was. This anonymity gave him a significant advantage. He could manipulate and intimidate her without raising suspicion among those closest to her. The journal's ambiguity was another major factor in the initial misdirection. Elara herself did not seem to know who was tormenting her. Her use of the name the Shadow Man reflected her own uncertainty. She was describing a feeling, a presence, not a specific person she could identify. Had she written, "I think Arthur Finch is following me," the case would have been solved in a matter of days. But her fear was more elemental, her enemy faceless. Her journal was a chronicle of effect, not cause. This is what made Detective Chen's approach so effective years later. He had stepped back from the emotional narrative of the journal and focused on the one area of Elara's life that had been overlooked, her finances. He followed the money, and it led him straight to the killer. The case became a training model in police academies, an example of how a cognitive bias, in this case, the assumption that a female victim's stalker is almost always a current or former romantic partner, can blind an investigation to other possibilities. The story also resonated deeply with the public. It spoke to a universal fear of the unknown and the idea that a threat can emerge from the most unexpected corners of our lives. It was a cautionary tale about trust and the importance of vetting the people to whom we entrust our futures. In the aftermath, the architecture firm where Elara had worked established a scholarship in her name. It was awarded each year to a promising female student of architecture, a fitting tribute to the career and the future that had been stolen from her. Elara's friend, Jenna, had struggled for years with guilt, wondering if she could have done more. She replayed their final conversation over and over in her mind, searching for any sign of distress she might have missed. In reality, Elara had hidden her fear well, not wanting to burden her friends or sound irrational. This was another aspect of the tragedy. Elara's own strength and independence had, in a way, contributed to her isolation. She was a problem solver, someone who faced challenges head-on, and she had tried to solve the problem of the Shadow Man on her own. Her call to the police about a suspicious person was her one attempt to seek official help, and when that had yielded no results, she had seemingly retreated back into herself, confiding only in her journal. It was a silent, lonely battle. The legal proceedings against Arthur Finch were swift. With his confession and the physical evidence, the prosecution had an ironclad case. He showed no remorse during his sentencing, his expression remaining flat and emotionless as the judge condemned his cruel and predatory actions. He was, in the end, a pathetic figure, a failed businessman and a con artist whose greed and ego had led him to commit the ultimate crime. He had destroyed a life and shattered a family, all to protect his web of lies. The community where Elara had lived also took steps to improve safety. A neighborhood watch program was established, and better lighting was installed in the park and along the streets, Her case, while tragic, had served as a catalyst for positive change, making the area safer for others. Chloe Vance, in her advocacy work, often spoke about the journal. She described it as both a blessing and a curse. It was a curse because it detailed the terrifying ordeal her sister had endured, but it was a blessing because without it, Arthur Finch would likely never have been caught. The journal was proof that Elara had been fighting back in the only way she knew how. She was gathering evidence, documenting the harassment, and creating a record. Whether this was a conscious act of self-preservation or simply a way to process her fear, it had ultimately served the same purpose. It ensured that her story would be told and that the truth of what happened to her would not be buried with her. It was her final act of defiance against the man who had tried to erase her. The quiet heroism of Elara Vance, sitting alone in her apartment and writing down her fears, became the central theme of her legacy. She was not just a victim, she was the first and most important witness to her own murder. Her meticulous nature, the very quality that made her a good architect and a reliable person, had made her a good witness as well. She had recorded details, noted patterns, and described events with a clarity that had eventually allowed justice to prevail. The story of Elara Vance and her journal is a somber and complex one. It is a story about the failure of the system to protect her, but also about its ultimate success in avenging her. It is a story about the darkness that can exist behind a mask of respectability, and the light that can be found in the written word. For all who knew her, and for the thousands who came to know her story, Elara remains a symbol of quiet strength. Her life was a testament to ambition and kindness, and her death was a lesson in the enduring power of truth. The shadow that had fallen over her life was ultimately vanquished by the light of her own words. If you found this case compelling, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated on similar true crime investigations. Until next time, stay aware, stay compassionate, and look out for one another.